The estate lawyer's letter said the property was assessed at $412. Not the house on it. The land, the dock, the boathouse that had been leaning into Lake Nipissing for 30 years. $412 for the whole of it, and her ex-husband's lawyer hadn't even bothered to include it in the division of assets. Too far. Too old. Too much trouble for a man who'd already decided what mattered and what didn't. Sylvia Crane was 53 years old when she signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday in February in a lawyer's office in Sudbury that smelled of burnt coffee and photocopier toner. 22 years of marriage, reduced to a stapled document and a cardboard box her husband's assistant had packed for her, a mixing bowl from her mother, 2 framed photographs, a half-used bottle of hand lotion she hadn't chosen herself. Martin hadn't come. He'd sent his lawyer instead, a composed young man who checked his phone under the table and referred to the family home in Sudbury, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, and the lake property in that flat voice people use when they're reading someone else's losses out loud. "This last one is yours," the young lawyer said, tapping a line near the bottom of the asset schedule. "Remote parcel, Nipissing District." He looked up with the expression of someone conferring a consolation prize. "There are back taxes outstanding. You'll want to address that." "How much is it worth?" Sylvia asked. "The county assessment is $412, he said. Mr. Crane's position was that contesting it wasn't worth the legal cost. She signed where he told her to sign. In the parking garage she sat in the car she'd been allowed to keep. A 7-year-old Subaru with rust beginning at the wheel wells, and held the copy of the deed with both hands. Her father had left her the lake property when he died 14 months ago. He'd died in October quietly, in the way he did most things, and she'd flown up for the funeral and driven back to Sudbury without going to the lake at all, because Martin had said the timing was bad, and she had learned, somewhere in the middle of those 22 years, to agree with him when he said things like that. The deed was soft at the creases. 2 acres on the eastern shore of Lake Nipissing. The boathouse, the dock, the cabin her father had built by hand over 3 summers in the 1970s. She had spent every July of her childhood there until she was 17, and then she had spent none of them there because Martin didn't like the bugs. She set the deed on the passenger seat. She had no apartment. She had no job, having given up her position at the health authority in Thunder Bay when Martin's firm relocated them to Sudbury 9 years ago. She had $1,432 in the account that had never been joint and an old Subaru, and a piece of paper that said she owned $412 worth of lakefront. She pointed the car north. The drive took 4 hours and changed 3 times. The highway thinned to a 2-lane. The 2-lane narrowed to a county road pocked with frost heaves, and the county road finally dissolved into a gravel track through birch and black spruce that wound along the eastern shore of the lake until it ended in a clearing. The cabin sat at the edge of the clearing, maybe 40 feet from the water. Log-built, dark with age, the roof patched in 2 places with tin that had gone the color of old pennies. The dock extended 20 feet into the lake and listed slightly to the left. The boathouse behind it had one wall that bowed outward in a way that suggested a private argument with gravity. The assessor had not been wrong, but the lake was still the lake. February and frozen, the ice going that deep blue-gray that means it's safe to walk on. The far shore a dark line of spruce 2 kilometers away under a white sky. Sylvia stood in the clearing for a long time with her hands in her coat pockets. The air smelled of wood smoke from somewhere distant and pine resin, and that particular cold that comes off lake ice, the one that has no name but that her body knew before her mind did. She'd come to see if there was anything worth saving before she called a realtor. That was the plan. The cabin key was the 3rd one on the ring from the manila envelope, long and brass and worn smooth. The door was swollen in the frame and required a shoulder to open, and when it did, the smell of the inside came out to meet her, wood smoke and cold ash and the cedar of the walls and something underneath all of it. Some particular quality of air that had been held in a specific room by a specific person for a long time and retained the shape of them, her father. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes find the dim. 1 main room, a sleeping loft on the left, a kitchen's lean-to at the back. A cast iron stove on a slate hearth, a plank table with 4 chairs, shelves along the back wall lined with the ordinary archaeology of a life lived carefully, a coffee can of mixed screws and nails, 2 kerosene lamps with clean chimneys, a row of field guides to Ontario birds and trees with cracked spines and pencil marks in the margins, a transistor radio, a coil of rope, a pair of wool socks folded neat. On a hook by the door hung his old Mackinaw jacket, red and black plaid, worn pale at the elbows. Before she knew she was going to, Sylvia crossed the room and pressed her face into it. It smelled like him, cedar and pipe tobacco, and the particular cold of a room that keeps its temperature even when no one is in it. She stood there a while. She'd done her crying in a guest room 3 months ago while Martin slept down the hall and that particular well had run dry. She did not cry now. She just breathed her father in, and then she straightened and looked around the room she had inherited. The practical part of her, the part that 22 years with a practical man had developed past the point of usefulness, began its inventory. List the land with a local agent. Sell the dock as salvage. Pay the back taxes from the proceeds. Turn $400 of assessed value into whatever a person could get for 2 acres of birch and lake ice, and a cabin that might or might not survive the spring thaw, and put the whole northern chapter behind her. She was still doing that arithmetic when the light changed. The sun had dropped behind the western trees, and what was left was the blue-gray dusk particular to February at this latitude. And Sylvia realized she had no intention of driving that gravel track in the dark. She told herself it was the road. She told herself the Subaru's headlights had been pulling left since October. But the truer thing, which she didn't put into words until much later, was that she did not want to leave the smell of the Mackinaw. She found wood stacked dry under a lean-to at the side of the cabin. More than she could have used in 2 weeks, split and stacked with a precision that meant someone had been here recently. She built a fire in the cast-iron stove the way her father had taught her. Birch bark twisted into a core, kindling teepeed over it. The damper cracked just enough. The iron ticked and warmed and pushed the cold back from the center of the room. She lit one of the kerosene lamps, trimmed the wick the way he'd shown her, and set it on the table by the window. And the small flame doubled in the dark glass and threw a warm circle over the whole room. She made tea on the stovetop, because that was the thing to do when you didn't know what else to do. And she sat at the plank table in her father's lamplight, with $1,400 to her name and nowhere in the world she was expected to be. And for the first time in a very long time, no one knew exactly where she was. The thought should have frightened her. It did not. If you're watching this and you've ever had a night like that one, when the silence stopped being empty and started being something else entirely, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. She slept in the loft on a tick mattress under 2 wool blankets that smelled of cedar, and she slept harder than she had in 2 years, and she woke at first light to the sound of someone on the dock. She lay still and listened. Footsteps on the old boards, deliberate and unhurried, the creak of the dock's one rusted cleat. Then silence, and then the sound of something being set down on the porch steps with great care. And then footsteps retreating along the shore. She climbed down the loft ladder quietly, pulled on her coat, and looked through the window where the frost had formed overnight on the inside of the glass. There was a woman standing at the edge of the dock with her back to the cabin, looking out at the ice. 60-ish, maybe older, in a heavy canvas coat and rubber boots with ice grippers. She stood very still with her hands in her pockets, the posture of someone who has learned to take up as little room as possible in the world. When Sylvia opened the door, the woman turned. She didn't startle. She simply turned and looked, the way a person looks at something they've been expecting. On the porch steps were a full quart of split birch and a covered pot that, when Sylvia lifted the lid, turned out to be beef stew. "Who are you?" Sylvia said. The woman studied her a moment. "Iris Gould," she said. "I live through the trees she tutted to the north. I've kept an eye on the place." "Since when?" "Since your father asked me to." Sylvia looked at her. "Why would he ask you?" Iris tilted her head slightly, the way a person does when the answer is complicated and they're deciding how much of it to give. "Come have tea," she said, gesturing toward the cabin. "It'll keep better indoors." That was how it started. Iris turned out to live 300 meters through the birch in a farmhouse her own parents had built, on land her family had farmed since 1931. She was 67, a retired school nurse, and she had a quality of stillness that Sylvia had only ever encountered before in people who have spent a great deal of time alone and made their peace with it. She drank her tea without putting anything in it. She answered questions directly and offered nothing more than was asked, and the first morning she stayed exactly 40 minutes, and then rose and put on her coat and thanked Sylvia for the tea as if she had been the guest. She came back the next morning, and the one after. On the third morning, she helped Sylvia haul the wood inside without being asked, carrying armload after armload with the efficient gait of someone who has been doing physical work her whole life. She told Sylvia, while they stacked, small things about Sylvia's father that Sylvia hadn't known. He came up every weekend, Iris said, even in November, even in January, when the road iced over and it wasn't sensible. She set a row of birch against the wall. He said the lake was the only place his head went quiet. Sylvia thought about Martin's apartment in downtown Sudbury, his firm's holiday parties, the particular quality of silence in the house, on the nights when Martin didn't come home until after she was in bed. She thought about the box on her passenger seat and the mixing bowl that had been her mother's. He never said much about your mother passing, Iris went on. But after, he kept the lamp in the window every night he was up here. I used to see it from across the bay. Just the lamp? He said. A house shouldn't look empty from the water. Sylvia stacked the last of the birch and stood there with her hands on her hips, looking at the pattern her father had left on the wall above the stovepipe. A collection of small marks, pencil and pen, heights and dates, going back to 1978. She was in there. She could see her own name in her father's printing, with a height mark at age 8 and another at 11 and one more at 14. She was not going to list this place with a realtor. She had known it since the first morning. She was only now admitting it. If you've followed Sylvia this far, stay with me, because what she found on the fourth day is the reason this story isn't really about a lake property at all. Subscribe now, because what was hidden in that cabin changes everything that came before it. She had been trying to level the stove which had settled on its hearthstones over the winter. She'd levered it off the slate with a length of pipe, an operation that took an hour and left her coated in ash. And when she swept the bare stone beneath it, the broom snagged. Not on a gap, on a seam, a clean straight line running along the edge of a hearthstone that didn't match the mortar lines anywhere else. She ran her fingers along it, worked the blade of a pocket knife into the crack, the way she'd done 100 times in a life that had required her to open things that weren't meant for her. The stone lifted. Dry air came up from underneath, and the smell of old paper and metal, and a kind of suspended time. In the cavity below the hearthstone were two things: a tin cash box, the green kind from any hardware store, and an oilskin pouch closed with a drawstring that had been tied and untied many times, its knot worn soft. Sylvia lifted out the cash box first and set it on the table. The latch opened without a key. Inside, $206 in small bills, a spare key on a ring with no label, and a folded receipt from a hardware store in Sturgeon Falls dated March 1989 for 2 sleeping bags and a Coleman lantern. Then the oilskin pouch. It was heavier than it looked. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents out onto the table, and they came in a rustling fall. Letters. Rubber banded in 3 groups, each bundle marked on the outside in her father's square printing. Received, read, keep. She counted them. 44 letters in 44 different hands, on notepaper and church bulletins and the backs of CN Rail receipts, and, in one case, a folded paper bag from a grocery store in North Bay that had been in someone's pocket long enough to go soft at the creases. She opened the first one in the keep bundle. It was dated July 11, 1987. Dear Mr. Audit, it began. I drove up to the lake that night because I had made up my mind about something and I wasn't going to change it. I don't know why I stopped at the light in your window. I knocked because it seemed rude not to, after the light. You gave me dry socks and a bowl of soup, and you didn't ask me a single thing I didn't volunteer. In the morning I drove back to Sudbury and I got my job back, and I married Carol in 1991, and we have a daughter who starts grade 3 in September. I thought you should know. I hope the lake is good to you this summer. Sylvia set the letter down. She picked up another, then another. She read them in the order they came, standing at the plank table with the lamp burning, and the stove ticking and the lake ice creaking in the cold outside, and the room was very quiet. Her father, René O'Day, had been keeping the lamp on in the window for 30 years, not as decoration, not out of habit. He had kept it burning on Lake Nipissing because in 1985, according to the first entry in a small brown notebook, she found at the very bottom of the oilskin pouch, a man had come out of the birch on a September night in the rain, walking away from something, and the light in the window had been the only light he could see. She read the notebook entry by entry, sitting on the hearthstone with her back to the warm iron of the stove. The handwriting was her father's, small and square and slanting just slightly uphill, and each entry had a date and a first name or initials and a reason, brief as a dispatcher's log. Sept 14, 1985, man on foot coming north, fed him. He talked till 3 in the morning, something that happened at work. Drove him to the bus in the morning, left him the fare, doors open if he needs it. Nov 3, 1986, woman and 2 boys, car trouble on the Nipissing Road, loft for 2 nights, got the car to the garage in Sturgeon Falls. She had a sister in Timmins, gave her the gas money. June 7, 1990, a girl 17, 3 days out from somewhere she wouldn't name. Fed her, sat with her. She slept 12 hours and then she talked and then she went home. I called ahead to make sure there was someone there who was safe. Page Jiftar page. 40 years of entries in a notebook no larger than a field guide. The paper soft with handling. The last entry dated 16 months before he died. Sylvia read it aloud into the empty room because the words were too particular to stay silent. March 3. A young man at the door at 11 o'clock at night. Came up the county road on foot, 4 kilometers in the dark. He had a black eye he didn't explain and a coat too light for the weather. I didn't ask about the eye. Fed him and gave him the extra Mackinaw from the hook, and he stayed 4 days and helped me patch the boathouse roof, and we didn't talk much, and that seemed to be what he needed. He left on a Wednesday, took the coat. I was glad of it. There was no final line in the entry, no resolution, just the date and the account, the way you'd record a weather event or a bird sighting, careful and factual, as if any of this had been ordinary. Maybe, Sylvia thought, it had been. She closed the notebook and pressed it flat against her chest and sat on the hearthstone for a long time watching the fire through the stovepipe seam. Her father had run a light in the window of a cabin on Lake Nipissing for 30 years. He had fed people and listened to them and put them to bed in the loft and given them gas money and dry socks and the extra coat off the hook by the door. And he had never said one word about it. Not to the county, not to the church, not to his own daughter, who had spent her childhood summers 15 feet from a hearthstone with a cavity underneath it. She never knew was there. She understood now what the cabin had been telling her since she arrived. The 4 chairs at the plank table when one man living alone needs only one. The spare sleeping bags in the receipt. The Coleman lantern. The way the loft mattress was rolled and stored at an angle that made it easy to unfold in a hurry. The lamp in the window every night, whether he was there or whether the cabin was empty, because the lamp in the window was not for him. If you're still here with Sylvia, take 1 second to subscribe and tell me in the comments, because the reason her father kept that light burning is the whole reason this story can't be undone. Stay with me. Iris came the next morning and found Sylvia at the table with the notebook open, and the letters spread out in their 3 groups, and she stood in the doorway with the cold coming in and looked at it all, and did not say anything for a moment. She knew, Sylvia said. It wasn't a question. Iris came inside and took off her coat and sat down across the table. She picked up one of the letters, just the envelope, and held it a moment and set it back. I didn't know about the notebook, Iris said, or the letters. He never showed me those, but you knew he kept the door open. Iris nodded, her hands flat on the table. First time I realized, she said, was 1992. I saw a man I didn't know come down through the birch in November, heading for the cabin. I was going to call the OPP. Then I saw your father open the door and hand the man a thermos without saying a word and wave him inside. She folded her hands. After that I stopped worrying about the strangers coming up the road. Sylvia looked at the window where the lamp had sat every night since she arrived, placed there by instinct, the way you do a thing that your hands remember even when your mind has forgotten. He never told me, she said. Iris was quiet a moment. He didn't talk about it, she said. He said once when I asked that if you tell people you're keeping a door open, they start looking for the catch. He said people who needed it most were the ones most likely to walk past a door that had been announced. She looked at Sylvia. I think he wanted the light to be the only advertisement. Sylvia was quiet for a long time. Can I ask you something? Iris waited. Were you ever one of them? The older woman looked at the table and then at the lake through the window, and then back at Sylvia. 2004, she said. My husband had died the year before and I was not doing well. I don't mean that as a euphemism. She held Sylvia's eye and Sylvia held hers. He kept me 4 days. Fed me and walked the shore with me and never once told me what I should feel or how long I was allowed to feel it. On the 4th day I went home and I've been all right since. She nodded once. I have my own way of paying it forward. Has done for 20 years. Sylvia closed the notebook and set it gently on top of the letters, and they sat with the stove going and the lake light coming in off the ice. 2 women in a room that had been holding its secret since 1985, and neither of them spoke for a while, which was not uncomfortable. It was only on the 6th day that the silver SUV came up the gravel road. Sylvia heard the engine from the loft, a smooth, well-maintained sound that didn't belong to anyone who lived within 10 kilometers. She came out onto the porch wiping grease from her hands. She'd been working on the dock's failing cleat, and watched a white Lexus pull into the clearing and stop with a certain decisiveness. Square in front of the cabin, the way a man parks when he's already decided the place is his. The man who got out was 50 or so, trim in an outdoor vest that had never met an outdoor situation. Good boots, the settled confidence of someone who has not been told no recently. "Miss Crane?" said. "My name is Gerald Forsyth, Meridian Lake Properties." He gestured around the clearing with a practiced sweep, the North Bay, the ice, the spruce line. "I made your father an offer on this parcel 3 times. He declined each time without explanation." He paused in the way of a man who considers other people's decisions puzzles meant for him to solve. "I thought his daughter might be more practical." Sylvia said nothing. She had learned in the last week the way her father had known all along. That silence left on the table long enough will make most men pick it up and hand it back to you in the form of everything they meant to keep private. "The practical part," Forsyth continued, "is this." He named a number, $9,000 for the 2 acres and the structures. When Sylvia's face didn't move, he named another, $14,000. He smiled with the portion of his face allotted for smiling. "The dock is a liability. The boathouse is half a season from falling into the lake. The cabin hasn't been inspected since 1998, and the wood stove alone is a fire code violation. I could make this property a problem you can't afford to keep, or I could make it $14,000 in your account on Friday. Given your situation, Ms. Crane, I think the math is obvious. Given your situation." 2 words, Martin's words exactly, deployed the same way, with the same quiet assumption that she had already understood her own smallness and would now make the appropriate accommodations. Sylvia felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It was not anger, exactly. It was something quieter than anger and more permanent. "The land isn't for sale," she said. "It wasn't for sale when my father was alive, and it isn't now." Forsyth looked at her the way men like him look at resistance, with a kind of flat recalibration. Then he took a card from his vest pocket and set it on the porch railing. "Think it over," he said, and got back in the Lexus and drove down the gravel track, careful on the ice, and she watched his taillights until the birch took them. Iris appeared from around the side of the cabin. She'd been there, Sylvia realized, the entire time. "That's the developer who's been buying up the eastern shore," Iris said. "He's got 60 acres under option, all around you." She looked at the tracks in the snow. "Your 2 acres are the only ones left with direct frontage on the bay." She looked at Sylvia. "Without your dock and your waterline, he can't market it as lakefront." "I don't have a lawyer," Sylvia said. "No," Iris said, "but I know who does. Subscribe right now, because the person Iris brought up that road the next day is the reason Forsyth never stood a chance. And the reason for that goes back further than you think. The truck that came up the next afternoon was a faded blue half-ton, with a cracked taillight and a bumper sticker that had faded past reading. The woman who climbed out was 71 years old, straight-backed and slow-moving, in a good wool coat and reading glasses on a chain. She carried a leather briefcase worn smooth at the corners that had clearly been into a great many serious rooms. She stood by the truck and looked at the cabin and the dock and the boathouse listing toward the ice, and something moved in her face that wasn't assessment. "Bernadette Quill," she said when she reached the porch steps. "I practiced family and property law in North Bay for 38 years. I stopped taking clients in 2019, and I've been very comfortable about it until yesterday, when Iris Gould called me and told me what was going on up here." She looked at Sylvia over the rims of her glasses. "Your father stayed a man out of serious trouble in January of 2001, and I've been intending to repay that debt ever since. May I come in?" She was there for 3 hours. She went through Forsyth's threats the way someone goes through a deck of cards looking for the face cards, pulling them out and setting them aside. Fire code violation. A developer cannot condemn a structure because he wants its water access. The county has issued no citation. That's intimidation, not law. We schedule an inspection and take the ammunition away from him. She tapped the table. "Wood stove maintained by the original builder is not a public nuisance. The dock is a liability on your property, not his. That's a negotiating bluff." She folded her hands. "Bluffs work on people who can't call them. So let's make sure you can." Then she asked the question Sylvia had been hoping someone would ask. "Did your father ever do anything with the development rights to this land? Any recorded agreement? Any conservation arrangement? Anything with a land trust or a provincial agency? She looked at Sylvia. Think carefully. Sylvia started to say no, and then she stopped, because there was the spare key in the cash box. The key with no label that didn't fit any lock in the cabin. And there was a memory she'd had while reading the notebook, a fragment of a summer afternoon when she was perhaps 14. A woman in a green vest with a clipboard climbing out of a government truck in the clearing, her father shaking her hand, the two of them going inside while Sylvia sat on the dock. And when the woman left, her father had come and sat beside her on the dock, his boots off and his feet in the water, and he'd said something she'd only half heard. He'd said, "That's set then. Can't be undone." She told Bernadette this now. The green vest. The truck, the phrase. Bernadette set her coffee down. Green vest, she said. Provincial ministry or a conservation authority. Could be Ontario Nature. Could be the Nipissing Land Trust. She looked at the spare key. Recorded agreement. She stood. Get your coat. The gravel track in the dark in the Subaru with its headlights pulling left and Bernadette in the passenger seat directing her. Turn here. Keep left at the fork. Slow down for this section. Bernadette knew the county road the way people know a road they've driven in every weather for 40 years. And she didn't explain it. She just said turn, and Sylvia turned, and somewhere in the 40 minutes between the lake and the town of Sturgeon Falls, Sylvia understood that this woman had loved her father in some practical, unsentimental, durable way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with debt unpaid, and the particular loyalty of people who take those kinds of debts seriously. The registry office in Sturgeon Falls was closed, but Bernadette had called ahead. And there was a clerk named Judith who had keys and a certain set to her jaw that meant she'd decided this mattered, and that was all the authorization she needed. It took an hour and a half. Bernadette knew what she was looking for, and she went through the deed books with the systematic thoroughness of someone who has read 1,000 of them, and she found it in Instrument Book 41, page 203, registered 22 years before René Audet died. A conservation easement. René Webb Audet, without ceremony, without announcement, without a word to his daughter, or his neighbors or anyone who might have made a story of it, had donated the development rights to his 2 acres on Lake Nipissing to the Nipissing Land Trust in perpetuity. The land could not be subdivided. It could not be developed for commercial use. It could hold one residential structure, the cabin that stood on it, and nothing larger, and this restriction ran with the land forever regardless of who owned it. Forsyth's title search would have found this in an afternoon. Sylvia stared at the page. Then he already knows, she said. Why offer me anything for land he can't build on? Bernadette looked at her over her glasses, and the look was not unkind, but it was very precise. Because he wasn't buying buildable land, she said. He was betting you didn't know what you had. He thought you were broke and grieving and freshly divorced, and would take $14,000 to make him disappear. And then, once the deed was his, he'd approach the land trust, which operates on a very small budget out of 2 rooms above a canoe shop in North Bay, and he'd make them an offer to release or amend the easement, give them a larger parcel somewhere less desirable, write them a check they couldn't say no to, get the restriction lifted quietly, it happens. She closed the book. He was counting on 2 things, that the heir was ignorant and that the trust could be bought. He was wrong, Sylvia said slowly. On the first one, he was wrong. On the second one, too, Bernadette said. But you'll want to go see them to be sure. The Nipissing Land Trust operated out of 2 rooms above a canoe shop on Main Street in North Bay, staffed by a volunteer director, a part-time coordinator, and a great deal of organized goodwill. The director was a man named Claude, 70 years old, who came down the stairs when they arrived and shook Sylvia's hand and held it a moment too long. The way you hold someone's hand when you have something to say that doesn't fit, in regular words. He took them upstairs and made tea, and they sat at a table covered in topographic maps, and he said, quietly, that he had been expecting this visit since the spring. They sent a man in March, Claude said, Meridian Lake Properties. Very polished, very reasonable, very patient. They offered us a 12-acre parcel near Mattawa, lovely land, genuinely good conservation value, in exchange for a partial release on the Audet easement. They made the same offer in June. He wrapped his hands around his mug. I let them finish the pitch both times. Then I said no both times. He looked at Sylvia. The man who signed this easement drove 40 kilometers in a February blizzard to sit with my wife in a hospital waiting room in 2003 while I was in surgery, and nobody knew yet how it was going to go. He sat with her for 6 hours and brought her coffee from the machine and didn't say much of anything at all, which was exactly right. He met Sylvia's eyes. "There is no parcel of land on this earth that I would trade for what your father was." Sylvia's voice, when it came, was careful. "He never told me any of this." Claude nodded. He wouldn't have. He folded his hands. "Men like your father, they're not keeping score. They don't do it to be owed. They do it because the door's there and the light's on and somebody needs it, and that's the whole of the arithmetic." The spare key, it turned out, belonged to a small lockbox in a filing cabinet in the land trust storage room. A thing Claude produced from the back with the air of someone who has been keeping it warm. Inside, the original signed easement, and beneath it an envelope in her father's handwriting. Her name on the front. Nothing else. Bernadette looked at her, and then at Claude, and then Claude said he would go make more tea, and Bernadette said she would help him. And Sylvia sat alone at the table covered in topographic maps and opened the envelope. She read it once, and then she folded it back along the creases that had formed over however many years it had been sitting in that lockbox waiting, and she put it in her coat pocket. She never told Iris what it said, or Bernadette, or anyone. But that night, back at the cabin, she tucked the letter inside the front cover of a new notebook she'd already decided to start, in the same way that you keep a thing you need to find again. Gerald Forsyth drove up the gravel road one more time, 11 days later. He did not get out of the Lexus. Bernadette met him at the window in her wool coat, with a manila envelope, and the registered easement, and a kind of composed finality that Sylvia could see even from the porch where she stood watching. She saw him take the easement from the envelope and push it back in. She saw his neck go red. She saw Bernadette say something brief, the way you close a file. And she saw Forsyth say something sharp, and she saw Bernadette wait it out with the patience of a woman who has been waiting 23 years for the right opportunity, and has all the time in the world. The window went up. The Lexus backed down the gravel track and she never saw it again. He came for the waterfront and found a locked door, Bernadette said, climbing the porch steps. The same door, in a way, your father had been leaving unlocked for everyone who wasn't him, for 30 years. She handed Sylvia the envelope and looked at the lake and the boathouse, and the dock listing west, and the birch going pale gold in the early spring light. "The easement is yours and it's clean," she said. "What comes next is up to you." By the time the ice went out in April, the county had found out the way it always does, slowly and then all at once. Judith, the registry clerk, told her sister, who told the North Bay Nugget, who called Sylvia and got a polite no, and then wrote the story anyway. Because a developer losing a conservation easement battle over a 2-acre lake property was news, and so was the notebook with 40 years of entries in it. Once Sylvia let them know the notebook existed. She hadn't planned on that. But she'd been rereading one of the letters, the one from the man who'd come in through the birch in September of 1985. And she'd thought, these people believed the door was private. They came because they believed no one would know. That's what made it safe. And she folded the letter back into its bundle and she decided the notebook itself could be known, so long as the names stayed where they were. People came up the gravel track in May, not in need this time, but in the particular way of people returning something. A woman who brought 2 flats of bedding plants and helped Sylvia put in a kitchen garden along the sunny side of the cabin. A man who arrived with his son and spent 2 days reshingling the south slope of the roof without asking permission or money. Iris organized the resetting of the dock, 8 neighbors on a Saturday morning, with a come-along and 2 new treated posts, and when it was done they all ate soup at the plank table, and someone's husband told a story about Renee O'Day that made Sylvia laugh until the windows rang with it. She found work that summer, 3 days a week at a health clinic in Sturgeon Falls, part-time intake nursing, the kind of work where you sit with people who are frightened and you make sure they understand what the doctor said, and you find them the form they need, and you do not rush them. The drive was 45 minutes each way, on the county road, and she found she didn't mind it. She used the time. She learned to run the VHF radio her father had kept on the kitchen shelf. She keyed it most mornings, gave the lake conditions and the weather, the ice status and the shoulder seasons, in the same flat, careful voice he'd used. She did it even when no one was on frequency to hear it, because a channel ought to have a human sound in it, in case someone out there was listening and needed one. And every evening, before she climbed the loft ladder, she filled the kerosene lamp and trimmed the wick and set it in the window. She did not think about it. Her hands did it the way her father's hands must have done it, because the window was there, And the dark was there, and the lake road was out there in it, and whoever needed the light most wouldn't be calling ahead. She started a new notebook. She didn't tell anyone. She found a hardcover record book at the hardware store in Sturgeon Falls, and she tucked her father's letter inside the front cover where she could find it. And she waited. She didn't wait long. It was a Thursday in September, a rain coming in off the lake in the way that September rain comes in, sideways and without apology. Headlights came up the gravel track at 9:30. A small car, older, one headlight slightly dimmer than the other. It pulled into the clearing and stopped, and a woman got out, somewhere in her 40s, in a jacket not quite warm enough for the night, and she lifted a boy, maybe 5 years old, off the back seat and held him against her shoulder. He was asleep. She stood in the rain and looked at the cabin and at the light in the window, and at Sylvia in the doorway, and her face had the particular expression of someone who has run out of every plan but this one. "I'm sorry," she said. "I saw the light from the road. I didn't think anyone was. I can go." "You're not going anywhere," Sylvia said. "Not in this. Come in out of the rain." The woman didn't move. "Why?" she said. Sylvia held the door wider. "Because there's a fire and there's soup on the stove and the loft's made up. Come in." And she came in. Sylvia fed them and warmed them and put the boy in the loft and made up the fold-out cot for his mother, and she did not ask one question that wasn't offered. In the morning the rain had blown through, and the woman drank 2 cups of coffee at the plank table and told Sylvia what had happened, some of it, the part she was ready for, and Sylvia listened, the way her father had taught her without ever meaning to. Without advice, without direction, without the kind of listening that is really just waiting for your turn. In the afternoon she drove the woman to Sturgeon Falls and helped her find what she needed, and she gave her the $40 from the cash box and the phone number of a woman in North Bay she trusted, and she filled her gas tank at the station near the highway before she sent her on. That evening Sylvia sat at the plank table and opened the new notebook. She wrote the date and then a first name and then, briefly, a reason. And at the end of it she wrote the only line that felt right, her father's line, the one she'd read 44 times now in 44 different envelopes. "The light's on. The door's not locked. Come back if you need to." She closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside the field guides and the transistor radio and the coil of rope. Outside, the lake was dark and still after the rain, the far shore a line of shadow 2 kilometers away, and the lamp she had lit was throwing its small warm circle against the glass. Doubled in the reflection, the only light on that side of the water. René Audet had kept a light in that window for 30 years, and he died before his daughter ever knew why. He'd left her $412 worth of county assessment and 2 acres of birch and lake, and a boathouse that still, probably, needed work, and a notebook with 44 entries in it, and a door that had been unlocked for 3 decades for every person who needed it most. He hadn't left her money. He hadn't left her a plan. He'd left her a lamp and a practice, and it turned out that was the whole of it. Maybe that's the thing most of us miss. We spend our lives measuring what things are worth on an assessor's card, the retirement account, the house on the good street, the portfolio, the good truck, and we let the people who measure that way tell us what we're worth too. And then one day we're in a parking garage holding a deed to $400 of lake and birch and empty cabin, and we think we've been left with nothing. But the things that hold a place together never show up in a property assessment. A man kept a light in a window for 30 years. He wrote each person down, not as a debt to collect, but as a life that had passed through. He never told his daughter, never told the newspaper, never told the county. He just kept the lamp trimmed and the door unlocked and the larder ready. And in the end, the quiet good he'd given away for free was the one thing on 2 acres of Lake Nipissing that no amount of Forsyth's money could ever move, because he had made it mean too much to too many people for money to reach it. That was René Audet's real inheritance. Not the land. The lamp and the long record of everyone it had ever guided home, and the simplest instruction a person can be handed. Keep it lit. Don't say much about it. Sylvia Crane had come up the county road with $1,400 and a plan to be gone by morning. She was still there when the ice came back in December, and she expected she would be there when it went out again, and again after that. She had a part-time job and a repaired dock, and a neighbor she was beginning to love in the particular way. You love someone who was your father's friend before they were yours. She had a notebook with 2 entries in it and a lamp in the window, and a lake that the county valued at $412, and that she would not have traded for any number Forsyth had ever thought to name. Some nights, when the lake was calm and the stars were out, and there was no wind in the spruce, she'd walk out to the end of the dock and stand there with her hands in her coat pockets and look at the water. And behind her, in the window of the cabin, the lamp she had lit would hold its small circle of yellow against the dark. A single steady point of warmth on the water, small and certain and burning, for whoever needed it next. The road came up to her door. The door was not locked. It never had been, and Sylvia Crane, who had arrived with a cardboard box and $1,400, and nowhere left in the world to be, understood finally that she hadn't been left with nothing. She'd been left with everything that mattered, and it fit in a lamp.